Okay, so let's talk about one of the protocols we'll be using together, Brainspotting. Brainspotting is really a powerful tool for healing trauma. Below, I'm going to give you a very brief background on how Brainspotting was originated, and then we'll follow by practical ideas for using Brainspotting in trauma healing. In addition, I would really strongly recommend that you look up Brainspotting on YouTube and watch David Grand to give a greater detail on how he began using Brainspotting. It may also be helpful to read some of his published articles or his book. Brainspotting was discovered by David Grand. He's a therapist in New York City. He was originally a trainer for EMDR. He also developed some variations on the standard EMDR protocol that he used in his private practice. It was while he was practicing one of these variations that he literally just stumbled onto Brainspotting. The motto for Brainspotting is, where you look affects how you feel. Grand believes this to be true for both positive and negative emotions. There's enough research from brain science to suggest that a brain spot connects your eye gaze position to neurological locations or networks in your brain. When it comes to trauma, the brain spot connects to unprocessed trauma that's at a deeper level below our cognitive or our thinking brain. Activating this spot through eye gaze allows us to have this information surface. First, it comes as body sensations that create tension in multiple body spots. It brings the sensory parts of the trauma up as well, things like smells and sounds and sights. And it also points out the locked up action tendencies or the urges that we still have from that moment. Brainspotting is really a body-based experience more than thoughts and feelings. Remaining fixed on this spot for several minutes allows these locked up sensations and urges to gradually be released. This continues until there's no longer any tension, or the tension has gone down enough to be more easily tolerated. This seems to go hand in hand with noticing and releasing urges and action tendencies that are connected to the trauma event. Throughout the releasing process, a therapist follows and encourages what's happening to help create a balanced and safe environment. This is really super important for stepping into these memories rather than avoiding or pushing them down. Lots of times, in Brainspotting, the therapist says very little during processing. Sometimes, I'll observe and point out body reactions a client may be having. Other times, there's words of encouragement and then reminders to breathe through the sensations, and these are also helpful for helping a client stay grounded and present in the moment. There are lots of ways to find a brain spot. We're going to focus on just a few of them, as that should be enough to get things started. Before we can do that, we need to clarify a few important terms. The first one is SUDS. This stands for Subjective Units of Disturbance or Distress. SUDS are a way for us to measure how much a memory bothers a client in terms of emotional and physical distress. It's usually a number somewhere between 1 and 10, and we can measure this when we begin processing and again throughout the process, and especially at the end. This term is pretty common in many trauma protocols, and that includes EMDR and ART. Another term is activation. Activation is a way to notice some changes internally as a result of landing on the brain spot. Sometimes activation is very slight and hard to notice. Other times, the activation is very noticeable and comes in body reactions, as well as in emotions and urges to take action. Activation is usually a sign that some type of processing is already happening. This can be easier for clients to identify because they don't necessarily have to think of their activation as disturbance. Activation is a term that's mostly applied to Brainspotting. The last term we need right now is Bilateral Stimulation, or BLS. Basically, BLS is how we engage both sides of the brain while we're working through trauma. Remember, each side of our brain holds very important information to heal from trauma, and we need to find ways to have both sides working together. This is pretty critical, and we will likely spend some time together finding the best type of BLS for you. Sometimes BLS is using headphones, where the music moves from one ear to the other while it's playing. Another type of device is called a TAC audio, and this creates buzzes in your hand. It moves from your right to your left, to your right, to your left, and then back again. One of my favorite ways to use the buzzers when I'm doing my own brain spotting is to take and gently rest these on my shoulders. That way I have my hands free to be able to write anything or just to notice what else is going on. Maybe one of my favorite ways to do bilateral stimulation with kids is to simply have them have their hands rest on their lap, and then we tap. Once the kids get this, then I teach them how to do the tapping. This puts them in complete control of the entire situation and allows them to step into the process in ways that they want to. Let's get back to brain spotting. The first type of brain spot we'll work with is called the outside window. It's called outside because the therapist finds a spot by observing what's happening on the outside of the client. And this goes on while the client follows a pointer very slowly, and the therapist notices any kind of body reaction or facial expressions. Once that's identified, the pointer rests in that position and the processing begins. Sometimes, in order to make it easier for clients and maybe a little bit more lighthearted, I will put a little stuffed animal on the pointer, and we'll use that as well. The benefit of the outside window is for clients who struggle with noticing activation when they begin with brain spotting. Lots of times this is the result of years of avoidance or maybe dissociation. Clients have learned how to push down or shut down their emotions and their feelings that are connected to the traumas because they're too disturbing. The downside to the outside window is sometimes it can be hard to find an activation spot, mostly because there can be several that are noticed during an initial scan. The other downside is that an outside spot is not quite as precise as the ones that we'll find on the inside window. The inside window is when a client can notice activation and then let you know at what point it's the strongest. When this happens, it's usually very surprising for the client. No matter how many times they've done brain spotting, when this spot is hit, most people will jump back as they notice the activation spot. After finding the spot, moving from one side to side, the therapist then checks to see if maybe there's any extra activation that happens from moving up or down at that exact same spot. Once the spot's established, the therapist encourages the client to allow as much activation as possible to surface and to be worked through. Both windows are processed until activation and disturbance reduces as much as possible. Sometimes this will go down to 0 and no activation remains. Other times we take it as low as it will go using just brain spotting. These two windows are the primary brain spots we'll work with for resolving trauma in relatively straightforward or less complex traumatic situations. Sometimes, the impact of long-term trauma has created a strong and overwhelming sensation. In these cases, clients may shut down or overreact when working through trauma experiences. It's important to remember that lots of these trauma memories have been suppressed for years, and this may be the first time that they've even been considered in a long time. In these cases, we can run the risk of not having enough activation or too much activation to make processing effective. Sometimes, dissociation has become an automatic reaction to thinking about trauma experiences. We need to have a way to gradually enter into the trauma until it's more tolerable before we can transition to the inside or the outside window. In these situations, we'll start with a resource or grounding brain spot. I believe this is one of the most valuable aspects of brain spotting when it comes to healing complex trauma. It's the primary reason why I use a resource spot as the entry point for addressing trauma with my clients. There are two ways that I've used resource brain spots in my work with clients. The first is the standard protocol used in brain spotting. With the standard protocol, we start with thinking about the trauma we want to process in general terms, without a whole great amount of detail. Holding this general memory in mind, we then look for any spots in your body where you experience a small sense of calm or feeling grounded. Once these are identified, we amplify or increase these positive sensations with a brain spot that seems to connect to those positive feelings. As we increase this positive sense of being grounded, we can then begin considering more details of the trauma in small pieces. As the trauma is experienced and the sense of disturbance realized, we can stay in that area for as little as 10 to 15 seconds, and then we can transition back to the resource brain spot and allow the positive sensations to return. This process is called pendulating. It allows clients to increase the amount of time that they're focused on the disturbing memory until they can reach a point of being able to stay grounded enough to transition into either outside or inside window. Processing then goes back as though you began with either one of those two windows. Another great application for resource brain spotting is to identify the ways you would like to see yourself handling difficult situations in life. We can then take this preferred way of believing and find times in your life when maybe just a little bit of this has been happening for you. We then search for this brain spot and amplify those feelings using the spots. This is a great way to get introduced to brain spotting. Early in therapy, for instance, one of the exercises we'll do is a description exercises. And this exercise tells you how you want to see yourself moving forward with life. So let's take a common example of one of these characteristics to illustrate how this can look with a brain spot. We can use joyful as one idea. Think back on a time when you were able to experience a great sense of joy. It can be a wedding, maybe a birth, a sporting event, any time that you can remember where you felt joyful. Now think about all the details of that event. The things that you can see, maybe what you hear, you smell, taste, feel, anything that's associated with that event. Now hold all those details together and notice the positive feelings that come along, and then tap your shoulders on either side. This creates the bilateral stimulation. Notice how these feelings can get stronger as you put all these ideas together. Once these elements are in place, we can use the feelings and connect them to a brain spot. This increases the positive sensations even more. As we work together, we'll also connect the cue word to these sensations. Eventually, if you practice this enough, over the course of a few weeks, the cue word almost instantly brings these same positive sensations and feelings up. All these ideas that go along with brain spotting can have major benefits for trauma survivors. As we work together, we'll find the best ways to apply this powerful tool to your situation, hopefully for the greatest potential for healing. Once we have a chance to take the activation from a brain spot down as low as it can go in a trauma processing session, we will usually transition to EMDR. So please take a look at the EMDR video to better understand how this transition happens and further creates greater healing.